Good morning, GCAP. I'm Raqi Syed. I'm speaking to you from Wellington, New Zealand. Let's get this show on the road. If you're here for my talk, Cinematic Look Development and Art Direction for Virtual Reality and Minimum Mass, you're in the right place. Thank you so much for joining me. Really quick, Minimum Mass is a story about a couple who experience a series of miscarriages and come to believe their children are being born in another dimension. It's a 6-DOF CG interactive 20-minute VR experience, and it was made entirely in Unreal Engine 4. So who am I? I'm Raqi Syed. I'm a visual effects artist and a VR developer. I also teach and do research at Victoria University of Wellington here in New Zealand. I've worked on a bunch of films. So I guess you could say I've done my 1,000 hours, maybe even an order of magnitude beyond that, working specifically as a lighting technical director on feature films for about 10 years. Some of that time was in feature animation at Disney Animation Studios in Burbank, California, and most of that time was in visual effects at Weta Digital here in New Zealand. My superpower is that I'm a VFX lighter. So I co-wrote and directed Minimum Mass with my partner, Areto Echeverria, but I also art directed, lit, and worked on it as a developer. As a lighter, I really wanted to understand what it would be like to tell a story that uses the materiality of light as a primary element. But this is also my biggest shortcoming. As a specialist lighter, there's a lot I don't know about texturing, modeling, animation. Areto's specialty is effects, editing, procedural systems, but between the two of us, and both of us worked on the project for a long time, just the two of us, we had to rely on our core skill sets and use what I call a bricolage approach to work quickly in the areas that we don't have expertise. So I'm going to get a little bit more into this later in terms of how it was good and bad to do this. This talk is really going to be about the push-pull between a game dev and a feature VFX mindset over the development of this project. Moving between a maximal VFX methodology, which was great for early look dev, but terrible for 90 frames per second, which is the frame rate that we needed to hit for interactive gameplay on the Oculus Rift S, which is the platform that we were developing for. And so it was really about trying to understand what a streamlined game dev methodology is. In this process, we had to make a lot of visual compromises, but we found that we were able to then eventually have a really good feeling playable experience. So this is sort of the main tension, like how do you have maximum visual fidelity and beautiful images, but also a playable experience, which I think is in the interest of everyone who's doing game dev. But I guess a lot of game dev people don't come to it with VFX baggage, which is sort of our starting point. So I really wanted to begin with this question of what does lighting and art direction informed directing look like? The look was really important to me on this project because as a writer, I knew that the subject matter was both difficult and real. While the concept of the story, children being born in black holes, is highly speculative. So how do you bring these two ideas together? Something that's very gritty and real and emotional, and something that's very speculative and fantastic. I really felt that in order for the story to work, we needed it to sit in a particular space of realism, so that the audience and the player bought that this is a cohesive world in which both these things are happening. And another question that I found myself asking early on in this process was, why does so much virtual reality look stylized? And the answer that I arrived at early on, and I still sort of sit with, is that VR itself is a very stubborn medium. It's really good at doing certain things, and it doesn't want to do other things that are outside of that. There's a lot of friction in the pipeline. And I think, you know, the frame rate is sort of the thing that guides that. And I think, to be honest, coming to this project with a kind of visual effects hubris made us quickly arrive at this understanding. We could push this medium far, this stubborn medium, but then again, we could only push it so far. So really, the development process was about understanding where that sweet spot sat. So I'm going to go through the ideation process first. And this process was really, for me, about identifying reference that signified the weird and the eerie. I began with the photos of Todd Hido, the cinematography of It Follows, and the mood and tone of the film Under the Skin and The Game Inside. So I'm going to go through some of the, like, specifically the visual language that is being communicated in these references, and how that then, like, really guided my thinking and the methodology for creating images from there. So with Todd Hido, the really important thing with his work is that the visual reference was dark and surreal, but not dystopian. The way Hido uses light in his photographs, I feel, really works to the strengths of the Unreal Engine. I interpret his images as having emissive light sources, single practical lights, one shadow casting light, and lots of crushed blacks. And this became the guiding principle for how to marry what we identified as a photographic reference with something that was achievable in the real-time engine. So here you can see, this is a great example of, like, what his landscape photography looks like. There's a subdued color palette. There's a single light source, which is often diffused through foggy atmosphere. And I felt like this was the perfect kind of tone for setting a story that takes place in the suburbs of New Zealand. In our case, in New Zealand, Todd Hido's photographs are taken in the States, but I felt like there was something very familiar about and translatable about the locations themselves. We see here, these are some more of his character-based images. Like, he does a lot of photography of female nudes. And you can see here that he has this, when shooting images indoors, there's these crushed blacks and these deep shadows with warm light coming through a single window. And that also felt like something that I wanted to explore in the CG world that we wanted to create for Minimum Mass. It Follows, which is a 2014 film shot by Mike Goulakis, kind of takes some of the similar principles and then puts it into motion. So here we see there's a lot of atmosphere that's being pumped into each scene, created by fog and smoke. And we knew that we would have to make decisions about, like, containing that in specific moments. But in the early concepting and ideation, I wanted to try to just be as free with that as possible. And the other thing that I love about It Follows is that it's a story that takes place, it's like a contemporary story, possibly set in the 90s, but possibly now. And it really captures the feeling of the suburban landscape that I grew up in, which is like 90s decor, but with a very distinct 70s hangover. And I wanted to do that with Minimum Mass. The other touchstone for me in terms of, like, mood and tone on this project was an exploration of the uncanny. And the uncanny is really a concept that emerges in Freud's seminal essay called The Uncanny, which he wrote in 1919. And the uncanny, translated from the German unheimlich, actually means unhomely. And Freud kind of talks at length in this essay about how this idea of the uncanny, the unhomely, really is about mood and tone that emerges in certain kinds of storytelling. So you know, largely surreal storytelling, but it's actually more specific than that. For Freud, the uncanny is about very contained surreal moments. He talks about how it's a strategy of juxtaposition. So it's really about taking two things that seem unrelated and putting them together. And this really resonated with me because that's really what minimum mass is. It's these two ideas, the emotional landscape of miscarriage and black holes that seem unrelated, but as soon as you put them together, something uncanny starts to emerge. And so it's really like going deeper into the uncanny. It applies to things that are intended to remain secret, hidden away, but have somehow come out into the open. And that is the theme that like is woven into minimum mass throughout the experience. The uncanny is really important to me because it's become a dirty word in visual effects for a long time. Uncanny valley, of course, but I really believe that the uncanny is a useful concept, a powerful concept for leaning into the psychological nature of computer graphics and how it can actually free visual effects and CG from its fixation on representation in a particular way. So for me, the uncanny is a very powerful way to explore art and allow CG as to function as an art medium rather than just a representational craft. So that was on a thematic level, one of my guiding principles for how light and art direction and computer graphics could function in this project. Under the Skin was another visual referent for this project, the 2013 film directed by Jonathan Glazer and shot by Daniel Landon. And the reason why this film is important is because it has these really contained visual effects that are set against a gritty, realistic world. And we knew that we wanted to do that for sort of thematic purposes, but we also needed to do that in a practical way because visual effects, like actual effects elements, are expensive, and we needed to choose the moments in which they would reveal themselves. And then, of course, Inside, the 2016 game by Playdead. And what I love about this game and the experience of watching this game and playing this game is that it's this very stylized, pared back, surreal world. And it makes use of the uncanny in a way that I feel no other game has for me. And I'm more concerned here with the mood and the tone than the look. I think the tone is what I really sought to capture in minimum mass, because it's like the way that I felt playing this game is the way that I want, hopefully, people to experience minimum mass as well. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about Planet of the Apes, the recent franchise, the recent version of the franchise. Particularly the 2011 film is a film that I worked on. I worked on the first two versions in the current franchise. And this film and the subsequent ones more so were really influenced by the cinematography of Michael Saracen. I'll just play some clips here for you. And in particular, the influence of his work on films like Midnight Express. What we see in these films is a very sooty, dark, shadowy world. He's not afraid to let characters fall into shadow. And working on this project and lighting creatures to match the plates that he had shot, and with these guiding principles, really had a profound effect on the way I think about lighting. And I very much wanted to understand what it would be like to allow characters to fall into shadow and emerge in and out of dark space, dark spaces in computer graphics, and particularly in an interactive virtual reality experience where it's not very common to allow things to feel dark and underlit. So I'll move on now to how this ideation kind of pushed the concept of the project itself. Evaluating and analyzing the reference allowed me to understand, or at least to speculate on what the strengths and weaknesses of the engine could be. So I'll get into a little bit more about how I did that. I created a lot of mood boards to think about how I could start to translate these references into specific environments. And I wanted to think specifically about color temperature of lights and material palettes. So here's an example of a mood board that I put together for the exterior of the house, one of the main environments in minimum mass. And again, like beginning with the Todd Hido imagery, but then actually juxtaposing real photographs from Rotorua, New Zealand, which is where the experience is set, and understanding, okay, Rotorua has all of this like very atmospheric, sulfuric fog, that's smoke that's percolating. How can that translate into this foggy atmosphere, and how can we use it to our advantage? Also films like Vertigo and The Matrix and the game Control, which use this green light to convey a feeling of urban alienation. I wanted to inject that into the project as well. And then in designing some of the environments like bedrooms and baby rooms, I wanted to look at some of my favorite creepy children's bedrooms in different films and images, particularly the photography of Gregory Crewdson, but then also classic films like Rosemary's Baby, AI, and Cría Cuervos. And so from these mood boards, I started to put together color script. I started to analyze the reference photo against base materials of marketplace assets that I had quickly put together to collage the environments. And so here I'm just like going into Photoshop and I'm looking at what are the color values of Todd Hido's photographs. And I can start to see and identifying some of those specific mood and material aspects that I know I wanted to pull from his photographs. And then looking also at Stephen Shore's photographs, who's an American photographer who's known for capturing a very particular kind of middle America decor. I knew I wanted this 70s hangover. So like what are the color values of these kinds of materials, like wood paneling, like lots of mustard and green colors. And again, just kind of trying to pull out some of the specific concepts that are conveyed in these photographs. And it became clear to me in looking at these that what the brightness level, what the saturation and hue levels were of these photographs. And so that really, the process of concepting and prototyping was actually pretty fluid. And we started to use a single environment, which is this house with a lounge and a bathroom as almost like a vertical slice to figure out how all of this stuff would work once we started building the environment. And a lot of this next stage, going from the reference to the concept and analyzing the concept images, was about wrangling shaders. How do I take marketplace assets which have shaders based on different paradigms? So some of them had packed textures, some of them used roughness, some of them used metalness, and sort of move to a material setup that could be simplified and controlled for consistent results. So here's an example of this environment, which we quickly prototyped by mainly using marketplace assets. This is just two sides of the same set. So this is the lounge area on one side, and then when you rotate it, there's a bathroom on the other side. And this became the base environment under which I now can start to actually analyze how my materials are behaving and start to align them more closely with the reference art. So again, I went in and looked closely at some of those, like, I know what those values were from those images, but what is the actual color palette in terms of diffuse values? And so I sort of had been eyeballing the color values this whole time, but when I did this, when I took these images into Photoshop and I started creating these color swatches, it revealed that the diffuse values of my materials were actually too bright, like about 15 to 20% too bright compared to the reference images. And so now what I could do is I could choose to either compensate for this in lighting, or I could align the materials, which would allow me to light consistently across all the different levels and environments once I built those out. And so I decided that the next phase was really going to be about creating a LUT and using the post-processing volume in Unreal Engine to apply this LUT across all the different sequences. And want to do a special thanks to Tillman Mild and his Unreal 4 Lighting Academy series, where he really talks through this process and how he did it for a particular environment. I found the LUT-based process to be a very cinema-based approach, so it was intuitive for me to understand how color and light and materials were operating together. But the LUT was really kind of like this training wheels system, which allowed me to prove and preview the look in real time. And I'm gonna get a little bit more into how that worked. I basically was able to take those, this information that I'd figured out, like, okay, all of my materials are about 15 to 20% too bright. What is it gonna take to make them look more like the reference images? And so by creating a LUT, I was able to essentially push the color values in one direction. Once I started lighting multiple, but then what happened is once I started lighting multiple environments, the LUT made it difficult to predict the outcome of lights, exposure, and materials. So here's an example of what the LUT ended up looking like. So this was a environment that I had lit. And then once I added the LUT, it sort of just aligned more closely. It's probably gonna look pretty subtle to you, but this difference is actually really important to me. This is sort of where my head was at because I was still in a visual effects mindset, but it just like crushed the darks a little bit. It made the lights more glowy and bright, and it kind of aligned everything more into that Todd Hido, Stephen Shore photographic world. But what I realized is that it's actually, once I started looking at how much processing power the engine was using to apply this LUT across every scene in the post-processing volume, it felt like it wasn't worth it. So I removed the LUT and then I just integrated this quality, like what was happening in terms of exposure and values, back into the lights and the materials themselves. And then I started using color temperature on the lights instead of tinting them. And this basically became a more optimized, practical way to light across sequences. But this like kind of like slow process of evaluating images in Photoshop, of creating a LUT and then applying it, was kind of like proving something to myself as a lighter, in terms of like I knew the look that I wanted to achieve, and I knew then that I could chase it in this particular way. So it became the basis on which then I could sort of integrate a lot of these things into just the lights themselves in the engine and the materials, of course. So through this process, we essentially created we then went and started creating a thin slice where we started cobbling together all of the different environments based on what we had learned through this one environment. And I'll just play some of these for you, some of these environments for you in the background as I talk. We spent, several months on the environment that I just talked about, and then several months more on like the rest of the environment. So let's say it was like 3 or 4 months on this lounge environment, and then another 3 or 4 months on everything else, just to get everything looking at least at the same level. And this process was really useful for us because we needed to understand the real-time engine and create a prototype so that we could apply for additional funding before our development runway ran out. But it was also really messy because once we nailed the looks, we had to go back and clean everything up because all of these assets had been cobbled together from the marketplace. So this is sort of what I was talking about, like the advantages and disadvantages of a bricolage approach. We were able to understand very quickly where we were going with mood and tone and basic layout, and also get a sense of the complexity of each environment and the length of each scene. So it was like almost like this became our animatic, our thin slice animatic for the entire experience. But the sandbox was really messy, and we had to then clean this, like step back and clean things up before moving into full-time production. So what did full-time production look like on this project? We decided we needed to hire a real level designer to help us simplify and scale this process across the entire sequence, which was, the 20-minute experience. The volumetric and emissive materials, so like, I guess one thing that's you'll notice about some of this prototyping stuff is there's like a lot of fog in many of these environments. So I had just like slammed volumetric fog and atmosphere all over these levels, and it looked great, but it definitely wasn't gonna be playable. So we had to figure out how we're going to achieve this Todd Hido visual quality and scale back the reliance on atmosphere and fog. So we hired Chris Garnier, who is a level designer with AAA game dev experience, and his job was mostly to tell us all the things we couldn't do, which was super useful process because up until now, it was myself and Areto and Sunny Tyke, who's also a visual effects artist, had joined the team to design some of the effects elements. And all three of us were relying on our visual effects skill set. And we really needed someone to push back on us and help us understand that look development has to be sort of pushed against with playability. And Chris was the person to do that. And the other important thing that Chris introduced into the process was helping us conform the project to a truly agile development process. I had been working fairly linearly up until then, and the workflow was also pretty destructive because we were using marketplace assets and collaging them together. And so from this moment forward, we moved the project into a version control system per force. We started profiling assets and materials for frames per second and optimizing workflows. And so Chris really took all of these art-driven findings that had come out of the process of doing a vertical slice and a thin slice and roll them out at scale across 11 more environments. And we moved away from using the post-processing volume to do expensive things like LUTs and reliance on atmosphere, and we started using it to do more optimizing things and more powerful things that could be rolled out across sequences, like triggering lights on and off. in order to direct the player's attention, and also then optimizing light and shadow for performance. Because I knew that I wanted to use area lights, and in some cases I could mostly get away with using a single shadow casting light, but in other cases we needed to have more than one. And so by triggering lights on and off, we were able to sort of balance that out. And Chris really brought that to the project. He also helped me understand how to evaluate light and shader complexity. So this is sort of the progression of this environment, from fully lit to looking at the diffuse values to looking how the light is operating when everything's sort of neutrally shaded. And you can see that like in the environment itself, like in the third slice, things are working pretty well with how materials are reacting to light. But then there was this under sort of area that we had, like the underworld of the minimum mass world, which each environment has this kind of terrain, like this ripped earth that it's been pulled out of. And these were still very collaged elements that we hadn't done a lot of work on, and they were expensive. And so this profiling process revealed to us that we needed to align all the materials, even the things that were sort of secondarily important on a visual level. And so the image on the right is great. Everything was working, but this is not where we started. When we first started, it was mostly red. And you can see here that this character, Rabia, her hair is still red, and I really had to fight for that. I knew I wanted hair that looked reasonably like hair. It needed to be simulated as well, so that when she's moving around. So it was like a series of compromises, like if I want that, then there's other things I can't have. And of course, this process of profiling light and shader complexity allowed us to compromise on where that made sense. So another thing that we were doing throughout this process was lighting for performance. Early on, we had started doing motion capture performance with non-professional actors. We had some research assistants that went through and just mocapped the entire experience out. And that really was just to allow us to place characters into environments and understand where they were at a given time. And then eventually we ourselves got into the suit, and then we also got some actors during our vertical slice and thin slice exploration to act out some of these scenes. And we took the rough layouts that we had designed and were able to stream them live during these mocap sessions to understand how characters moving through space, number one, works with the location of the player in the virtual reality volume. And also, as a lighter, I was able to quickly understand that the scale of some of these sets and the location of the practical light elements in CG wasn't working and needed to support performance. So an example is when Rabia is in the bathroom and she sort of like goes to the medicine cabinet, pulls out this pregnancy box test, reads it and throws it away. And the bathroom fixture was in the wrong place. It was on the wall. It was sort of mounted in a way that the light was coming out. It was backlight. It was backlighting the character at first. And then, well, it was front lighting her and then backlighting her. And basically it really wasn't working as a lighting setup that allowed the character to move around in space efficiently. So I addressed this in a classic film way, but in a way that is probably intuitive to a lot of immersive developers as well, which is that I just created top lights instead. And in this way, like the lighting is much more flattering. You get shadows. So it was actually more amenable to achieving that Todd Hido look, because you get these dark shadows that are happening underneath the character. And then also it generally works across the entire space. But it was actually only through the motion capture process that I understood how these things needed to sit physically in relationship to one another in the game engine. And here's another example of like a scene in which these two characters come, they're driving in a car and they park up next to their house and then they go into the house. And in our original thin slice, when we had collaged all these elements together, we sort of imagined that it was this like built out gravelly driveway on the left, and that the car would drive towards the house, park right in front of it, almost perpendicular to it, and then they would get out and go into the house. And then this just really wasn't practical with the the volume space that we had for motion capture. Our motion capture volume was like 6 meters by 8 meters. And it just, and the digital set had been designed to be much bigger than that. So we very quickly on set reconfigured it so that the car just kind of pulls up perpendicular to the house. It's actually very close. And then they just get out and walk into the house, and we didn't need all that other gravel and built out foliage that actually would have tanked the frame rate anyways. So another problem that kept coming up was how the interaction, the interactivity of minimum mass, sight lines, motion, and lighting were working together. We had built this interaction mechanic which allowed I guess one thing I haven't mentioned is that this project actually takes place at diorama scale. It's a miniature. So you can hold these environments in your hand and manipulate them. You can rotate them, you can translate them up and down. And initially we also had a mechanic where you could scale them up and down. So you could pull your hands and scale the environment up and then do the opposite and then make it miniature. And this was always like not really working with the way that the environments had been designed. We had a skybox and we had this horizon line, and every time you scaled the environment up and down, it created a kind of nauseous feeling because the brain and the body were not aligning. It's kind of that classic John Carmack thing where you're getting someone to do something physically that doesn't match the digital world. And so the first thing that we did, one of the first things that we did when Chris came onto the project is we simplified the mechanic itself so that you weren't scaling ever. You were just rotating and translating. And in order to scale the experience, in order to get closer to the diorama, you just moved your body. So it meant that we would need a bigger play space for the experience, but that it actually felt good because physically you were doing something that made sense in your digital space. But the horizon and the sky still presented a problem with the logic of the diorama, because you could rotate this environment, but then what was happening with the skybox? Was it staying where it was? Was it also rotating? We tried designing the sky, the cloud cover, the skybox in a number of ways, but it just never felt right in the context of the logic of the miniature. So we kind of decided that the thing that made the most sense was to just remove the sky altogether. And then actually things just suddenly felt right. Like a bunch of things that hadn't been working, that had been preventing us from achieving some of these early references of like the noir, the dark, the uncanny, the like exploiting the virtual reality space as a place of the subconscious. It all clicked into place. Suddenly the volume became a dreamscape, and these dioramas kind of became this like theater black box where it was inherently noir because it was just floating in black space. What's interesting is when we were first developing this project, we incubated it at the Sundance New Frontier Lab in 2018, and Sachka Unseld, the virtual reality developer, was one of our mentors, and he actually had really encouraged us to think about the VR volume as a dreamscape. And his experience, Dear Angelica, of course, does that really well. These images kind of emerge and disappear into blackness. And it's like relying on the negative space of the VR volume to fill in the psychological blanks. And so once we got rid of the sky and the horizon, like all of this started to make sense, and it just felt like this is really the look. So now I could come back to the color script with more knowledge and understand better, like, what are these 11 environments going to look like all together as a single experience. And so this is sort of where we had arrived. These are all the different environments, and by letting them all hover in black space, aligning the color palette of the materials themselves, but then also the lights, simplifying the light rigs so that I'm really not tinting the lights ever. I'm just using color temperature, in this case, a very warm color temperature, or a very cool, like a warm color temperature that's essentially sodium vapor, which is again referring back to that Planet of the Apes reference. That was really the look that they were trying to nail in Planet of the Apes, is like the sodium vapor, when sodium vapor used to be the way in which street lamps were lit, which is very cinematic and beautiful. So I wanted to recreate that, but then also the green urban alienation, which is actually sodium mercury light, which has gone out of style. So these two kinds of light temperatures were the bookends of the warm interior spaces, and then the cold alienated exterior spaces of places like the hospital and the airport. Kind of finally came together. And when I was able to look at all the sequences together as one, I could see that the color script made sense on an emotional level as well. So it was a very slow process, which started with this crib vortex environment, played out in this like kind of bricolage way, then was able to be prototyped across a thin slice, and then eventually in a more structured way from a game development mindset. And that allowed us to move much faster for all of these remaining sequences. So I want to share now with you the trailer, which hopefully will convey how all these elements came together to craft what I believe is a surreal, uncanny, and eerie world of minimum mass. So the initial design brief for Minimum Mass was to work to my strengths as a feature VFX artist and to create a photorealistic, later revised to be photographic look for virtual reality. Once we understood the limitations and strengths of the real-time engine, we revised this brief to be more photographic and stylized, instead of what we had been chasing, which was this photorealistic look. And really, this process of hybridization, what we felt was taking the best of offline rendering in terms of design and real-time rendering, and then combining that with the playability of real-time rendering. which brought us closer to the conceptual goal of minimum mass to create a realistic, immersive dreamscape. This is a feedback, a comment that we got from one of the jurists at Annecy where the project played earlier this year. He said, I felt like Hitchcock playing with Barbie dolls. This is Brandon Oldenburg. And I feel like this really captures this hybridization of what minimum mass is, where it's like drawing on the tradition of cinema and the kind of voyeurism, the act of looking, what it means to look in on secret worlds, while also drawing attention to the playability of the experience, and that it's just, there's something very precious and fun about playing with dolls and holding miniature items in your hand and manipulating these worlds. And I really hope that minimum mass, like this push-pull process of like working with a cinematic background and trying to better understand what is possible with real-time and immersive, has allowed us to create this experience. I want to give some really quick team shout outs first. I have an awesome team, my co-director, Areto Echeverria, of course, Chris Garnier, our level designer, Sunny Tyke, our effects designer, John Aberdeen, mocap guru, Jimmy Wilson, our sound designer, and a bunch of other creative artists who worked on the environments and really helped build this whole thing out at scale. I hope that you guys will get a chance to actually do minimum mass. It's playing at a bunch of festivals in the next few weeks, including New Images in Paris. And of course, all this stuff is happening virtually. And a lot of the platforms that these experiences are being hosted on are offering audiences to access them for free. So I invite you to do that and hopefully experience minimum mass. Thanks so much to the organizers of GCAP for inviting me to share this talk with you today. I'm available, I guess, on another platform to have some chats and answer some questions, and hopefully we can continue the conversation there. Thanks again for making time to hang out with me, learn about minimum mass, and I hope we get to meet and have more conversations. Bye, GCAP.